All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Our webinar is centered around the ICEAN, which, if you're not familiar, is the Adjust Non-Stock or Direct Order Entry. We have with us today Jan Zambelli. She is a business consultant here with Central Data. I'm sure a number of you have had the chance to work with Jan already and are aware of her expertise in areas like these. Because of the number of people on the call today, we're keeping the lines muted. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or the QA section. And just a reminder for Thursday, October 12th, we have our webinar for the Intro to Product Recommender. Daryl will be presenting how machine learning technology within CSD is benefiting distributors that are looking to provide upsell and cross-sell recommendations to customers. Scott will share how you can read your data for advancements in AI technology within CloudSuite as well. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Jan.
Thanks, Mark. Welcome. Good afternoon. Hopefully you find some things helpful here today. As Mark said, this is the introduction to ICEAN, Inventory Control Entry, Adjust Non-Stocks and Directs. We're going to go through the introduction right now, and I'll talk about the purpose of why we're here. We're going to go over some tips to avoid having discrepancies in the first place, which will also involve some security. We'll get straight into looking at the ICEAN screen, talk about the different types of records, how to recognize what kind of stage something is in. We'll do some inquiries on the orders and the purchase orders to do some investigating and do some actions to those actual records that have discrepancies. And we'll talk about some reporting that you might find helpful. And then we'll open it up for questions for all of you. So our goals and objectives are to discuss the common procedures you can do to stop having discrepancies to begin with, to go over all the examples and show you hopefully one of each type of example that can be out there, and make sure that you understand how to address those discrepancies, what the best procedures are to do. At the end of this, you should be able to work within your own company to hopefully tighten up some procedures and stop having problems and different setups in the system, whether it be security or just procedural, and also to be able to go in and start using the ICEAN if you're not already, or if you're already using it, hopefully you've learned some tips and tricks here to be able to adjust things a little bit easier. So with that, I'm going to go into the system here. So the purpose of why we're here is to talk about direct inventory and non-stock inventory. As most of you hopefully know, CloudSuite, SX, all the different versions will require you to have separate general ledger accounts, separate inventory general ledger accounts for directs and for non-stocks. And that is because the system is always going to bring things in when we receive and remove things out when we sell to our customers. And many times discrepancies happen with that. In our typical stock inventory, we can't drive a negative. You can't sell something you don't have. But on the non-stocks and the directs, there are ways that some of the users can find around that. So one of the typical things that we recommend that you do to try to avoid is set a procedure that no one should be making changes to costs or the quantities on direct or non-stock lines after receiving. Because if you have an order that's in the system, so the particular order that I have on my screen here is in the ordered stage, and if I go to the line item detail, I can see that I'm ordering 40 at $37.30 each for the price, but my cost is $22.33. I can click over and hyperlink over to my purchase order. And in that inquiry, I can see it's printed, which means it's been sent over to my vendor. But if I look at my line here, my quantity should be the same, 40 with the $22.33 in there. If I make a change in the system before receiving, we recommend you make that change in order entry. So you could actually come to the order and actually hit maintain, go make the change, and it should automatically change it on the purchase order. You may need to resend that to the vendor if it was a change in quantity that you need to document, but that's typically the order we recommend to do. if you change a cost on the purchase order, it will eventually flow through to the order when you invoice it out, but you run the risk of having these appear like they're out of sync in the meantime. But if you receive the product at this 2233 and then you go into the order and change the cost, the system will let you, if you have the ability and the security to touch cost, and it will then be out of balance. It will cause a discrepancy. So again, always make your adjustments before receiving and try to make them in the order side so they automatically flow to purchasing and link right away. The other thing is we recommend you never manually update the quantity shipped. So if I'm in order entry, so I could maintain this order here, if I come in to the line detail, and this is CloudSuite, but I actually update my line and look at my extended fields, if I have security to be able to touch this quantity shipped, I could manually override this right now and I could change this to 50 quantity, change this to 50, and it won't necessarily match the purchase order. So you don't want to be overriding this. You want to let the system assign this quantity shipped when the goods get received. The only exception that we found for that is if someone was in the middle of editing or maintaining this order when the goods were received, it may lock that order and not update it, but it's pretty rare that you're going to find that. So you want to make sure you have proper security on that. The other thing is you don't want to cancel the sales order without canceling the purchase order or vice versa. But typically we find the customer's order gets canceled. And if I'm allowed to, if I have security to break ties, then I can go ahead and cancel the sales order and not take care of the purchase order. If I never called the vendor and I never canceled the PO, the items are going to get shipped regardless. Then they're going to get received in and paid for, but we're never going to have a sales order to send them to. So they're going to sit out on this ICEAN as quantities available, but nobody can see them. They're not part of our stock inventory. Nobody knows they're there, and you have to address that discrepancy. The last two things that I found a lot of times that people will do is it's a little more rare, but they'll actually go in and change the items. So I set this item up as widget 1, but maybe later I find out that's not really what it's called. It's called a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I can delete this line and create a new one, but it's not going to be linked to the purchase order and it's not going to have the same product number as the purchase order. So when you receive it in to the system, it's not going to automatically commit to the sales order and ship it. You'd have to manually do that. And then you're going to end up with a positive and a negative in the ICEAN that has to get cleaned up. So if you have a product change, you need to change it on both. You need to delete both lines. You need to add that back in and source it back to the purchase order so the products match. And the last thing is if you use a cumulative PO. So in this day and age, post-COVID, we find a lot of people are stopping at a Menards or a Home Depot to pick up an item to add to whatever it is that they're delivering because we don't have it in stock. Our vendor can't get it to us quick enough. We're not going to stop our delivery. We're going to drive by the store on the way, grab it from another vendor, and move on. And so if you are using that feature, the system is going to make the assumption that you received all of what you put in. So if you later go to the sales order, this was a cumulative, you could go there and say, well, they only had 38. So you're going to bill out 38 and move on, and you cancel the other 2. It leaves the system hanging out there with the quantity received of 40 on the cumulative PO. So you need to make sure you keep an eye on that. If there's quantity discrepancies, they need to be fixed on both sides. All right, so for security, there is the ability to block, if you look in the operator setup, there is the ability to block overriding the quantity shipped. So we will look up Julie's because apparently she is JZ01 here. And I believe it's in the entry options. there is, in the very first section of the entry options tab, there is a quantity ship override. So you can let them override, you can let them decrease only, or you can let them not be able to touch the quantity shipped at all. So that's one way to be able to avoid some of those things, is set that security. The other security that is very important to know is the authorization points. So your system administrator usually is going to be the one that will look at these, but I tend to come in here and type in, for CloudSuite, I can type in the word tie, so I can see all the different things that have to do with breaking ties. So it tells you which module, if we're talking specifically order entry, you can allow or not allow people to be able to cancel or delete ties. You can actually put in that they can only do it at certain stages of the orders. If it's an ordered stage, they can do it, not others. So that's something that you want to take a look at for your security and try to tighten up so that people will stop deleting things on one side and not the other without getting proper management approval and following it all the way through. All right, so I am going to go straight to the ICEAN. So you can do that in the CloudSuite. You can always just look it up here. I type the code, or if I knew that the answer was something else, I can do that. Or I can go from my menu. I can go to products, to entry, and then there should be an option in here, adjust non-stocks and directs. So either one will bring us to the program. On the left-hand side, there's some filters, and the warehouse is always required. Our recommendation is for you to consider having each warehouse own their own discrepancies, so that, and maybe have one other person kind of overseeing all of them to make sure it's fine. But you do have to fill in a warehouse. And then typically you're going to pick whether you're looking at your drop ships or your non-stocks. So I'm going to start with my drop ships. But all other flags in here, you can drill down specific, looking for a product or a category. You can even look at inactive things if you want to look at something that happened before, or sort the dates. Maybe you don't want to look at most current because you know those might be timing issues. We're going to look at everything today. So I'm just going to hit my search, and I have some different discrepancies in here. So one of the discrepancies that is not a bad thing is just a timing issue. The way items show up on the ICEAN here, as well as on the direct inventory report, ICRTD, or the non-stock report, ICRTN, will be when we receive. So as soon as we receive product, it's going to come onto this report. Doesn't mean that it's a discrepancy. It just means we received it in and we have not invoiced it out yet. So my example for that is purchase order 17. I actually sold multiple things on there. I sold the widget 1, 2, and 3. I'll just grab one of these items to look at. But I can see that line 3 of this purchase order has a quantity of 150 at a price of 125. That doesn't, just because it's listed here, doesn't mean it's a problem. So if I come back out to this list here, I can drill down on the actual purchase order to go to inquiry. And I can see this purchase order has already been received. It's already been costed against an invoice, so therefore the PO is closed. That means whatever bill I got from the vendor must have matched because the quantities are all fine in there. But if I come to the line items, I can pick any one of these lines. I'll choose line 3 since that's what we were looking at. I can drill down and look at the tie to find out what sales order. So it tells me my sales order, and it does tell me it's a direct order. But if I come over here, this particular sales order, when I look at the line detail, I can tell that I ordered all 3 of those items on the PO were all for this. That's how direct orders will be. If I looked at my quantities, 5, 1, and 150, I come back here to the purchase order and the same thing, 5, 1, and 150, and I can actually check my costs here and make sure that my costs all match, and they do. So this particular one is just a timing issue. If I look at my order has already been shipped. because on dropship orders, as soon as we receive them, it marks the sales order as shipped. It commits the quantities for us. We did not override this. These should have been filled in automatically, but no one has run invoice processing yet. And so this item is strictly a timing issue. It's listed on this report here, but as soon as I invoice process this order, 42, then it should go away. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to invoice that out. And for my purposes, I am just going to do this very simply and quickly. I will pick my order. It was not on hold. I will make sure I don't send it out to anybody because I'm practicing, but everything else should be fine. So once I invoice, I'll come back to the order and confirm that the order is now invoiced out. If I come back to my adjustments and search again, you're going to see the 17 went away because it was strictly a timing issue. On the flip side, for the non-stocks, there can also be timing issues there. So for direct ships, you really shouldn't have timing issues unless there was a reason we were holding out the invoicing. Maybe we were waiting for a proper freight charge to add to it. Maybe they were on credit hold for some reason, but at this point, if the items were drop shipped to them, there really is no point in holding off to bill. So typically drop ships are going to be received and invoiced to the customer all in the same day. So you usually shouldn't see timing. On non-stocks, there can be timing issues on these because maybe we receive it in, but the order is marked ship complete. Or maybe the customer's coming to pick it up next Friday, or they don't need it and they told us, their route isn't till next Wednesday, so we're not shipping it out. So this particular one, PO 18, is my timing issue here. Again, I see my PO, I received 7 at 72.45. I can even see right here that the different information of the status. So it shows me that the quantity is complete, but it shows me the PO order stage because this line is about PO, that the PO is already closed. So I can see without even drilling down onto the purchase order that I know I've already matched a bill to it. But if I come here and look up the purchase order and hyperlink over to the sales order, so you can see I've already matched my payables invoice, but I'm going to come to my line and drill down, look at my ties. I can see this order is a regular stock order because this was not a drop ship. I can see it's in the pick stage, so we have not invoiced it out. We're picking it, but maybe it's waiting for a route, maybe it's waiting for the customer to come pick it up. And when I invoice this out, this too will come off of the list. So that's the first thing you need to be aware of, as things on here may not be a problem, they may just be timing. One of our customers recently has asked for an enhancement through Infor, or I don't know if they've entered it yet, but they were going to fill it out, where you can actually have a notes column here that you could write a little note to yourself that this was timing, and maybe give yourself a date to double check if it doesn't clear out by the end of this week or this month, to double check it again. And I think that would be really helpful to know, so that I wouldn't, if I had a list of 50 things here, I would know not to keep touching that one over and over. So I thought that was a good enhancement thought there. So some of the common discrepancies would be costing problems. So I'm going to go back to the drop ships. I always like to start out with drop ships because those should be cleaner. They should be much more straightforward and we have more control over those. The sales order goes in, it creates the purchase order, which moves to a printed stage, and the next thing we know, we get a bill from the vendor. So we have a much better opportunity on the directs to check and make sure our quantities match, our costs match, our products match, nobody overrode anything or changed stuff. If I have to add a freight charge to charge the customer, I'll do that. But then when I receive the product, whether I do it through POEI, receiving, or I do it right through the Vendor Invoice Center, APECE, and tell it to go ahead and receive at the same time, the sales order will move to a ship stage automatically. And if you're running invoice processing at night, it will invoice that same night. So typically, unless you're checking this for current day information, so you can see the date that these things happened. So as long as they weren't today's date on a direct, they should not really be in here. If they are, if it's a timing issue, we want to know, why haven't we invoiced the customer? Why did we hold out? So for here, our direct order, we're going to look for a cost variance. We're going to look at purchase order 16. So on this widget 1, when I drill down in here, I see multiple things in here. And you see my PO 17 that I did earlier where we invoiced it all the way out. This is still listed here because it's showing me all the activity that happen when there's problems, but this particular one didn't have a discrepancy. It just isn't going to clear until the other does. But we received 5 at 22.33, and our OE sales order, we did a -5 for that. And so there is no quantity or cost discrepancy on that. Those bottom 2 lines are fine. But on the top line, I have my quantities match. I received 10 in, and I have a -10 that goes out on the sales order. But somebody overrode the cost. After receiving, someone went in and changed the cost on the sales order to be $20 instead of 22. So that is a cost problem. And anytime you see any kind of discrepancy there, the quantity or the cost, you want to ask yourself, what are the stages of the sales order and the purchase order? So in this particular case, it shows the sales order is invoiced. It shows the order stage of INV for invoiced, but the purchase order is only received. It's not closed. It has not been matched to a bill. So it's possible that maybe when the vendor bill comes in, the vendor did only charge us $20 and someone just didn't go change it on the sales order and purchase order. They waited till after receiving to fix it, and they're going to fix the cost on the receiving side at payables time. So that's possible. On direct ships though, that's not very likely. Direct ships, usually you're going to do that due diligence and make sure your quantities and your costs all match before you do your receiving. So at this point, you have to figure out what you're going to do with this. So if we look at the bill and say, yes, we paid $22.33 to the vendor, but yes, we only charged the cost as $20 to the customer, what do we want to do with that difference? So we can, if it's a minimal amount of money and we're not necessarily going to make a big change on it, we can actually go through and adjust this. So I'm going to do that now. Typically, if you are doing any kind of corrections in here, any kind of adjustments, I'm going to check next to the one I want to do, and I have 3 choices. I can adjust, I can write off, or I can move the items to inventory. Adjust is when you have a quantity discrepancy, which is not this example. So if I needed to add or subtract and I just want to write it off, it's going to put it to your whatever GL account you have for your physical adjustments. That's where it will adjust. The inventory will physically take the item and move it over to your stock inventory. So in the case of I received 10 in, I only sold 9, and I've closed the sales order. I just kept the extra 1. I can move it into my inventory so at least it's visible for everyone to know we have it and we can potentially sell it out. But the write-off is the one that we want when there's a cost discrepancy only. So we're going to choose write-off. It opens up a journal. And the first thing I see here is it tells me how much my variance is. And when you come down here, you notice on the write-off, this is all grayed out. The only thing I can touch is a value. I can't touch quantity because this is only a cost adjustment. And I always want to do the opposite. So if this cost is a positive number, I am going to do this as a negative. And then when I submit it, it should ask me if I want to close the item, and typically you would say yes because we're writing everything off. And there's something wrong with my GL setting here. So I'm just going to fix this here temporarily. So it should have pulled the right division in the system, but for some reason in my settings it did not. So I submit it, and you notice it now goes away. So it actually took that difference of cost. We received it in and paid for it at one cost, but on the sales purposes, we wrote another. I just wrote it off. If that was a significant cost amount and we wanted to make sure that flows through on our sales reports, we could go in and do a new order entry for cost only. We can do a correction order to correct the costs. You can mark it as our records only so it doesn't send out to the customer, or you can run it internally and just print it out yourself instead of sending it to them. But if it's a small dollar amount that's not significant, you don't have to go back and correct it on the order side. That's your procedure, whatever your procedure is. And then coming to the non-stocks, you'll see we do have a cost example here as well with purchase order 19. I can see that I have a PO and an OE, quantity 1, -1, but the costs are 111.24 and 109.75. This one is certainly a small dollar amount, even smaller than the $23 I did. So you have to determine for your company, at what point do you just write something like that off when there's a small discrepancy. This would never happen though on directs or non-stocks if someone did not override costs after receiving. So the only way that that can happen is if I override it after receiving. If I do it before, even if I do it on the purchase order, it will eventually update the sales order when we invoice it. So you can test that out in your training system and go through those examples. But now, quantity adjustment is a little bit different. So I do have a direct order one and actually I only have a non-stock order one. So because typically on the direct orders, if I've done my due diligence, made sure my quantities match, my costs match, I really shouldn't have had a lot of discrepancies on those. But for a non-stock, it could happen. It could happen either way. So I could have a quantity variance where we received it in but oversold it. So I will look at purchase order 20. This one we received higher. So in here, again, my purchase order was already received. It just hasn't been matched to a bill, but I received in 3 units at $65 each. And then I only sold 2 out to the customer and it's already been invoiced, but I don't have a back order. Somebody manually overrode the quantity after receiving and said, we only want 2, not 3. So we brought 3 in this warehouse, but we only sold 2. What happens to that other item? Are you going to return it to the vendor? If you are, you need to put it back in your stock so you can return it. Are you going to just put it on your shelf and try to sell it? We want to make sure it gets put in stock inventory. So that's what we'll do on this one. We're going to check next to this, and this one we're going to pick inventory. So I want to adjust it into my inventory. You can create your product number and description. It pulls up however you had the non-stock, but the catch here is you have a choice. You can mark it as an order as needed. You can specifically mark it as do not reorder if you don't ever want to buy this again for this, but you can bring it into the inventory however you want. You can even put it as a true stock, but at least if it goes into your inventory as one of these, you will be able to see it. It will be visible in order to be able to sell that again. So I'm going to hit continue here. It doesn't like something that I'm doing here. And my vendor is required. So I do not recall which vendor I used here. So you would usually know who the vendor is, but if you don't know, you can go look at the vendor in your inquiry. So it wants me to put in the vendor that I purchased it from, and then I'm able to continue. What else is it yelling at me? Purchase line is required. Purchase line. I don't know if that's what it wanted. Okay. So it wanted me to pick my warehouse. So then again, at this point, it asked me for the quantity of 1, if I had 10 in here, am I going to be adjusting all of them? And I'm always going to do the opposite. So I'm going to do a -1 quantity, and it already put my cost in there. I can even tell it which bin location if I'm using bins. And now this item should come off of my ICEAN, and if I went into inventory, I would see that item in there. Right, and I also did have a direct order that had a discrepancy, and this will happen. It should not happen, but it will happen. So this particular one, I received in 10, but somebody manually overrode the quantity and sold them out to the customer for 11. So at this point, what would you do? If you've already invoiced your customer, you've already paid your vendor, you basically overcharged your customer. Are you going to go in and do a credit to the customer? Are you going to just let it ride the way it is? If you're going to let it ride, you can just write that off. So that's what I will do on this one. I'll say, you know what, somebody fat fingered it. At this point, the customer didn't complain. We're not going to bring it up. We're just going to adjust it off. So you would come in here, and this time we would do adjust because there's a quantity involved. Quantity, you have to do adjust or inventory. Cost only is write off. So I do my adjust, and very similar to the other, because it's a +1, or a -1 rather, because we sold too many, I have to do a +1 so that it will zero out. And then I do want to fill in my cost in here. So now that particular discrepancy is gone as well. So the last discrepancies that I had in here were canceling lines or breaking ties. So basically, if you create a sales order out there with a purchase order, you receive it in, but somehow the sales order gets canceled at any stage of the game. If I have the authorization to cancel and break ties, this can happen. So I have my purchase order 21. I see that I have received the PO for 3 at $60 each. But I believe when you come in here, it even shows broken. Before I even drill down and try to look for the sales order, I can see that that's broken. There is also a feature in here, if you had 20, 30 adjustments that you had to deal with, you could look at your broken ones individually. So you could say, I only want to look at broken. So for instance, I have 3 discrepancies here. When I check that box, it's only going to show me my broken one. So I can tell there's a broken tie already, but I can still drill down on the purchase order, look at my line detail, and go over to the tied order, and it will tell me where it used to be tied. Even though the tie is broken now, it holds that data. So I can look at sales order 46, and lo and behold, this sales order is canceled. I see the status of canceled, and I see someone put a note on there, so that's nice that they were nice enough to give me a note. But why didn't they follow through on the purchasing side? Because now we never called the vendor. Oops, sorry about that. I always need to minimize so that I can scroll this little thing. My screen is too big to see our notes. So you can see my notes here. So someone was nice enough to say that the customer canceled, but they didn't contact the vendor because the vendor shipped it to us anyway, or maybe it was already on its way. Customer canceled the order. But if I didn't have the authority to do this, I wouldn't have been able to cancel it in the first place. But now at this point, you have to decide what you're going to do. Are you going to keep it and move it to your shelf because we're going to try to sell it to somebody else? Or are you going to adjust it into your inventory and then just do a return back to the vendor? Will the vendor let you do that? Are you going to charge the customer anyway? So you can make those decisions in there. Now for the approach of what you would do for this, if you have been using the ICEAN, hopefully you've learned some tips in here that you can take a look at to avoid creating new problems, to maybe handle some of the problems that you've had out there a little bit better or a little more organized. But what are the next steps for you? Whether you've been using this or you haven't been, I would highly recommend at least working from today forward to try to prevent creating more discrepancies. We're always going to see timing issues in here if you receive things in but don't sell them out right away. But for all the other things out there, we want to try to minimize creating the problem in the first place. And then get your warehouses to own each of their own discrepancies. They know their own products. They know what they shipped and didn't. If payables is the one that handles all your drop ships, make sure they're checking the sales order and the purchase order quantities and costs before they do any receiving. It will avoid so many problems. But I highly recommend at least trying to do from today forward. And then the other thing that you can do is start looking at dates. So in CloudSuite, you have the ability to come in here and turn filters on, and you can only look at dates from a certain point on or a certain point back. So I had one customer who was looking at this 9 months after they went live. They had a lot of problems for the first week or two, and sometimes they were only $1 or more. And so they went in and attacked that part of the project and said, you know what, for the first 2 weeks, I'm going to assume we didn't know what we were doing. I'm going to glance at them and do the quick investigation, but if it's, under $100, I'm not going to spend our time looking into it. I'm going to assume if it's a non-stock or a direct, I just got to adjust it and fix it, and what we build, we build. I'm not going to go back and correct customers' bill 9 months later. So you can kind of chunk out all your history and figure out, at least by cleaning up some of the smaller ones, and you're going to start finding patterns. You're going to find that a certain branch was always overriding quantity shipped. So maybe we got to go in and change our security to stop that branch from being allowed to do that until we can trust that they're not going to just do it on non-stocks and drop ships. You can find out if there's a manager for certain warehouses, maybe that can help oversee some of this so that they can go in and look. I always like to come in here and see what all my discrepancies are, and sometimes I even export them out, and then I'll come in a few days later and see if anything's changed. Is it growing and growing, or is it just shifting? Does it look like it's all just timing issues? So you can take a look at that. You can have somebody else oversee that as well. And then from a report standpoint, there are a few reports that can really help you. I'm not necessarily going to run those here, but you can run the ICRTD, which is your direct inventory control reports. Direct, the trial balance direct. So you can run this particular one. It's probably one that's already set to run daily, possibly to a file because it's a balancing report. It balances to a GL account, but you can set up your own report to remind you and email you for directs once a week. Email a copy to yourself to remind you, hey, look at this. Why would anything be on here? Because if we have a direct, it should receive in and invoice out all in the same day. This report should be 0. So if it's not, at least once a week, I could glance at it, catch it. You can run it by location. So if you want each location to be in charge of their own, or if you wanted your payables to be in charge of all directs, you can do that. The ICRTN is the non-stock report. Very similar. It's the trial balance for non-stocks. This one, we don't necessarily expect them to wash in and out in the same day because they are physically coming to your warehouse, and we may or may not ship them out right away, or the customer may not pick them up. They might be for a ship complete order, but at least you can keep an eye on, and especially in your warehouse, they might be a good person to actually view this once a week. You can create your own separate report from the balancing one that maybe it runs once a week to the warehouse manager so they're aware all of these non-stock special items that we brought in the system, why are we not shipping them? Maybe somehow the quantity shipped didn't happen or the pick ticket didn't spit out for some reason, and they can troubleshoot and look into those on a more proactive basis. And then the other report that I will look at some of the options for with really quick is the OE report exceptions. So there's a lot of great things on this particular program, but if I come in and look at the store job that I have here, you could schedule this to run automatically. Again, you can always limit by warehouse. Your warehouses are going to look at their own, but there's a lot of great questions in here, including, are there any erroneous PO or warehouse transfer ties? When we did something, did we break any ties? So if you say yes, those should be on your report if those are problems. Did somebody override something? So we talked about the quantity shipped, I think was in here. So we have cost override. Does someone ever touch the cost after they put them in? We want to know about it. And if people are overriding promise dates and different things. So you can help catch yourself. Quantity shipped is less than the quantity ordered. So I want to know if anyone, contradicted themselves here. If it's not in yet, you can do quantities overridden, and back on the ranges tab, you can do different stages. So everything in a ship stage that has the quantity shipped less than ordered, maybe I want to catch those exceptions. But I would definitely say the shipped override is a big one. I would say the erroneous ties is a big one, because if those are things that I know, and the cost overriding, if someone's doing any one of those things, those are some of the key reasons that cause problems with directs and non-stocks. So very powerful report. You can certainly see a lot of that in the ICEAN program, but these reports can help other people help keep an eye on it, or it's just a different format for you to be able to look into it and figure out what happened. All right, so Mark, I would say it's a good time for some questions, if anyone has any.
Okay, so I see one here about how soon the recording will be available. Usually it's by the end of the week, and typically these videos make it their way to the YouTube channel as well. I can drop that link in the chat. Question for you, Jan, is there a way to see who did the override, and can we request that enhancement?
So if someone does the override, there is a program in the system that you can run on a particular order, and it's OERM, or it's the master list on an order. So you can actually run this for a particular order if you knew it, and I would have to guess at one of the orders that I did here, but I could grab one of my orders and see. I'm just trying to find one that I know that I overrode. 20. That's a great question. And there's a lot of questions in here. I typically don't change a lot of these unless I am doing a big report, then I might change some of those. But this particular report, OERM, is a way to look at the master list of data. And it does typically show you, it's a little busy when you go to read it, but it does typically show you when things are overridden. And I'm sorry, my view is very strange here, so I can never scroll very well. So I open up my report here, and I will zoom in a little bit better. So you can see different information in here about this order. it shows me a lot of information in here, but typically what I'll do is do a Control F and I look for the word override because that's usually what I want to see. So it tells you if the tax was overridden. It tells you if the discount was overridden, the add-ons, the credit, and the commission, if that was. And this was not maybe a great example of one that I had overridden things on, but this would be a place that you'd be able to see if someone overrode cost or the quantity shipped, things like that on a particular order. All right, any others?
Don't see any. All right. If any of our attendees today still have questions to ask, but you're unable to right now, please feel to reach out this week or to me directly, and I'll make sure that you're connected with our team. I believe that'll conclude today's webinar. Great job, Jan. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. I hope you find this helpful.
And for those of you who are here today, make sure you join us Thursday, October 12th as well for the Intro to Product Recommender. And again, if you have any follow-up questions on this topic, please reach out and I can connect you directly with Jan, get her some schedule time with you or anyone else on our team as well. So have a great rest of your day and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.